Hello there, and welcome to Umber Dreams Archives. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable, wherever you are. Let your weight settle into whatever surface holds you now. Where in the world are you watching from? A quiet bedroom where the day has finally released you? A cozy corner where the night wraps around you like water? Perhaps somewhere the dawn is just beginning to touch the sky? Tonight we're going to explore the deep ocean, a realm that covers more than half our planet yet remains more mysterious than the surface of Mars. We'll discover why 95% of this world remains unmapped, understand the creatures that thrive in absolute darkness, and contemplate what it means that the largest habitat on Earth is one we've barely begun to see. It's a journey that spans from the sunlit surface to depths so profound that mountains could hide there, completely unknown. But don't worry. This isn't going to be a frightening descent into dark waters or a catalogue of alien monsters. Instead, we'll move slowly and carefully through the history of deep sea exploration, the patient work of scientists who illuminate one small corner at a time, and the quiet wonder of discovering that our home planet still holds secrets. By the end, I think you'll find there's something deeply peaceful about knowing that mystery still exists, that the Earth can still surprise us, that wonder is still possible. If you enjoy these calm explorations of the unknown corners of our world, a like and subscribe really helps reach others seeking the same peaceful way to end their day. And to those already subscribed, thank you for being here, night after night. Your presence means more than you know, so settle in. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Take a slow breath and let it out even more slowly. And let's begin our slow drift downward through the deep ocean. There's nowhere you need to be right now. Nothing you need to do. No pressure to understand everything. No test at the end. Just listen and let the story unfold like the ocean itself, layer by gentle layer. The abyss can wait. We have all the time in the world. Let's begin with a truth that might surprise you. We have better maps of the surface of the moon than we do of the ocean floor that covers 71% of our own planet. We've sent rovers across Mars, tracked the storms of Jupiter, photographed distant galaxies. And yet, right here on Earth, beneath the waves that lap against every shore, lies a landscape we've barely glimpsed. The numbers tell a remarkable story. Of the 361 million square kilometres of ocean floor, we've mapped perhaps 20% with anything approaching the detail we'd consider complete. The rest exists in our records as approximations, estimations, educated guesses drawn from satellite measurements of the water's surface. Scientists can detect slight bulges in the ocean, where underwater mountains pull more water toward them through gravity. They can sense depressions where trenches fall away into darkness. But these are shadows of the truth, outlines of a world we cannot see. To understand why this matters, imagine if we knew Earth's land the same way. Cities would be approximate locations, mountain ranges would be general suggestions of elevation. The Grand Canyon might be noted as _0_. This is how we know the ocean floor, the largest landscape on our planet, the foundation of 71% of Earth's surface. And there's something remarkable about that if we pause to consider it. Something that speaks to how young we are as explorers of our own world. The technology exists to map the ocean floor in detail. Sonar systems mounted on ships can paint pictures of the seafloor beneath them with remarkable precision, revealing valleys and peaks and plains in stunning clarity. But here's the challenge that brings us gently to our first real understanding of the abyss. To map the ocean floor completely using current technology would require a single ship travelling back and forth across every square kilometre of ocean, a journey that would take roughly 200 years of continuous sailing. It's not impossible, it's simply vast. This vastness is our first introduction to what makes the deep ocean so different from any other landscape humans have tried to understand. It's not merely deep. It's not simply dark. It's fundamentally immense in a way that challenges our ability to comprehend it. When we say 95% of the ocean remains unexplored, we're not talking about forgetting to look in a few corners. We're talking about a habitat larger than all the world's forests, deserts, and plains combined, existing in a realm we can only visit briefly, at great expense, protected by technology that would have seemed like science fiction a century ago. And yet, this ocean we cannot fully map has been here all along, covering the planet since long before humans walked upright, shaping climate and weather, producing more than half the oxygen we breathe, regulating temperatures, driving currents that determine whether nations freeze or flourish. The ocean isn't separate from our world. It is our world, the dominant feature of the planet we call home. We simply happen to live on the parts that stick up above it, the minority surface, the exception rather than the rule. There's a kind of gentle irony in this. We named our planet Earth after the solid ground beneath our feet, when perhaps we should have called it ocean, or water, or the blue planet. We think of ourselves as terrestrial beings, land creatures, when the truth is we live on an ocean world. And the deepest parts of that ocean, the abyss that gives this journey its name, remains almost entirely unknown to us. Which brings us naturally to a question worth contemplating as we drift deeper into this story. If we cannot map the ocean floor, if 95% remains unexplored, what exactly is down there? What exists in those unmapped places? What might we find if we could somehow illuminate every corner of the abyss? The answer to that question lies in what we've discovered so far, in the small fraction we have managed to see, and in the history of how we learned to see it at all. Before we can understand the abyss, we need to understand pressure. Not the pressure of deadlines or responsibilities, but the physical pressure of water itself, the simple weight of the ocean pressing down from above. It's this pressure, more than darkness or cold or distance, that makes the deep ocean so profoundly difficult to explore. At the surface, we live under one atmosphere of pressure. The air above us weighs approximately 14.7 pounds on every square inch of our bodies. But we don't feel it because we've evolved in it. Our body's perfectly balanced with the air around us. Descend just 33 feet beneath the ocean's surface, about the depth of a typical swimming pool if it were stood on end, and the pressure doubles. Now you're experiencing two atmospheres, one from the air above the water, one from the water itself. Continue down another 33 feet, and the pressure increases again. Another 33 feet, another atmosphere. The ocean adds one atmosphere of pressure for every 33 feet of depth, a mathematical certainty as reliable as gravity, as inevitable as night following day. And the ocean, we should remember, can be far deeper than 33 feet. The deepest point in the ocean is the Challenger Deep, located in the Mariana Trench in the Western Pacific. At its deepest point, the trench descends to approximately 36,000 feet below the surface, nearly 7 miles straight down. At that depth, the pressure reaches more than 1,000 atmospheres, roughly 16,000 pounds per square inch. To put that in perspective, if you could somehow place a car on your thumbnail, the pressure at Challenger Deep is roughly equivalent to balancing 3 cars on that same small space. This pressure has profound implications for exploration. A human body, unprotected, would be crushed instantly at such depths. Our lungs would collapse, our bones would fracture, every air-filled space would implode. The pressure isn't malevolent, it simply is. The neutral consequence of all that water above, each drop adding its small weight to the tremendous accumulation of weight below. But here's what's remarkable, what hints at the resilience of life and the adaptability of living things. Creatures live at these depths. Fish swim through water that would destroy a human in seconds. Crustaceans crawl across the seafloor under pressure that could crumple steel. They don't merely survive, they thrive, perfectly adapted to a world of tremendous pressure, unable to live anywhere else. These creatures have evolved without air-filled spaces in their bodies. Their cells are filled with water, incompressible, able to maintain equilibrium with the pressure around them. Some contain special compounds in their cells that counteract the pressure's effects at the molecular level. They're not fighting the pressure, they're existing within it, as natural in the abyss as birds are in air. This creates an interesting symmetry. Just as we cannot survive in their world, they cannot survive in ours. Bring a deep-sea creature to the surface quickly, and the reverse happens. The pressure that supported its body is suddenly gone. It would, quite literally, fall apart. The abyss isn't just deep. It's a different environment entirely, a separate realm governed by rules so unlike our own that the creatures there are as alien to us as we are to them. Understanding this pressure helps us understand why the deep ocean remained unexplored for so long. It's not that we didn't want to look. It's that the ocean actively resists being looked at. Every foot deeper requires stronger materials, more sophisticated engineering, more careful planning, and every foot deeper increases the consequence of failure. Early attempts to reach the deep ocean floor ended in crushed equipment, imploded vessels, designs that seemed sound on the surface but failed catastrophically under pressure. The ocean is patient, it doesn't attack. It simply waits, exerting its tremendous force, testing every seal, every joint, every weakness, and if it finds one, the result is swift and absolute. This is why, even today, more people have been to space than to the deepest part of the ocean. Space is vast, distant, difficult to reach. But space doesn't crush. The vacuum of space pulls outward, which is easier to design against than the inward force of the deep ocean. The abyss demands respect, demands perfection in engineering, demands humility from those who would venture into it. And so, for most of human history, the deep ocean remained not just unmapped, but fundamentally unknowable, a realm we could only imagine, filling in the darkness with speculation and wonder, and sometimes fear. For centuries, human maps of the ocean were less about what existed, and more about what might exist, what could exist in places too deep to explore, too distant to know with certainty. Where mapmakers lack knowledge, they fill the empty spaces with imagination, and often that imagination turned toward monsters. Medieval and Renaissance maps of the ocean are remarkable documents, part geography and part mythology. In the margins and open waters, artists drew great serpents with scales like shields, their bodies coiling through waves large enough to swallow ships. They sketched whales the size of islands, so massive that sailors might mistake them for land and anchor there, only to be dragged beneath the surface when the creature dove. They illustrated squid with tentacles long enough to pluck sailors from masts, pulling entire vessels down to depths from which nothing returned. These weren't necessarily meant to be accurate depictions of real creatures, at least not entirely. They served partly as warnings, marking dangerous waters where ships had been lost. They indicated areas of uncertainty, places where normal navigation became difficult. But they also reflected a deeper truth about how humans have always related to the unknown. We populate it with creatures of our imagination, giving form to our fears and fascination. The ocean encouraged this tendency more than any other landscape. On land, even unmapped territory could be traversed eventually, could be seen and measured and understood. But the ocean floor remained absolutely inaccessible, separated from human eyes by miles of water and crushing pressure. What lived down there could only be guessed at, and those guesses tended toward the dramatic, the fearsome, the impossible. Interestingly, some of these imaginings weren't entirely wrong. The giant squid, drawn on maps with artistic exaggeration, does exist. Not quite as large as the island-sized beasts of legend, but remarkable nonetheless, with eyes the size of dinner plates and tentacles that can extend 30 feet or more. Whales, while not mistaken for islands, can grow to lengths exceeding 100 feet and weights of 200 tons. The ocean's serpents of legend might have been glimpses of oarfish, ribbon-like creatures that can grow to 50 feet long and swim with an undulating motion that looks eerily serpentine. But the maps showed monsters for another reason too. one that speaks to the fundamental challenge of describing something you cannot see. In the absence of data, speculation fills the void, and speculation about the deep ocean tended toward extremes because the environment itself was extreme. If fish could live where sunlight never reaches, perhaps they were fish unlike any others. If creatures could survive crushing pressure, perhaps they possessed forms and abilities beyond normal understanding. This tendency persisted well into the modern era, when the first photographs from the deep sea began emerging in the mid-20th century. The creatures they revealed seemed to confirm our most imaginative fears. Fish with transparent heads, creatures that glowed with their own light, jellyfish trailing tentacles hundreds of feet long. The reality of the deep ocean, it turned out, was often stranger than the monsters we'd imagined. And yet, there's something the old maps got wrong, something crucial to understanding the abyss as we prepare to descend into it together. The monsters on medieval maps were always depicted as aggressive, as threats, as malevolent forces waiting to destroy. But the creatures of the deep ocean, for all their strangeness, are simply living their lives. They're not lying in wait for humans. They're hunting smaller creatures, fleeing from predators, reproducing, surviving in the only environment they know. The deep ocean isn't hostile, it's indifferent. The pressure isn't trying to crush us, it's simply there, a consequence of water's weight. The darkness isn't hiding monsters, it's the absence of sunlight at depths sunlight cannot reach. The cold isn't attacking, it's the temperature water reaches when the sun never warms it. Remove human presence from the equation, and the deep ocean is simply another ecosystem, as neutral and natural as a forest or a desert, with its own rhythms and cycles and communities of life. This realization, that the ocean wasn't full of monsters but full of life, came slowly, gradually, as humans developed the technology to actually see what existed in the depths. And that technology, that ability to finally illuminate the darkness, required first understanding that we needed to look in a different way, which brings us to the inventors, the dreamers, the engineers who figured out how to build vessels that could withstand the pressure and carry human eyes into the abyss. The first serious attempt to reach the deep ocean involved a steel sphere barely large enough to hold 2 people, suspended from a ship by a cable thinner than seemed wise. It was called the bathysphere, and in 1930 it carried naturalist William Beebe and engineer Otis Barton into waters deeper than any human had descended before. The bathysphere was, in many ways, a vessel of pure audacity. Imagine a hollow metal ball, about 4.5 feet in diameter, with walls 1.5 inches thick to resist the pressure. No engine, no propulsion system, no way to move except up or down as the cable from the surface ship raised or lowered it. 3 small windows made of quartz, each only 3 inches across, the only views into the abyss. And inside, 2 men, cramped together in the dark, breathing air from tanks, absorbing carbon dioxide with trays of chemicals, trusting their lives to welds and calculations and hope. Beebe's first descents were shallow, testing the sphere's integrity at depths where rescue might still be possible if something went wrong. 200 feet, 400 feet, 600 feet, each descent a small victory, a proof that the sphere could withstand the pressure, that the cable would hold, that the quartz windows wouldn't shatter inward like bombs. And then, on June 11th, 1930, Beebe and Barton descended to 1,426 feet, deeper than sunlight penetrates, into what Beebe called a world as strange as that of Mars. Through the small quartz windows, he glimpsed creatures no human had seen alive before, fish that glowed with their own light. Shrimp-like creatures that sparkled in the bathysphere's beam, jellyfish trailing delicate tentacles through water that pressed against the sphere with more than 600 pounds per square inch. Beebe was a naturalist first, an explorer second. And his descriptions of what he saw through those tiny windows read like poetry. He wrote of quote 2 of fish that seemed to be quote 3 of a realm, where conventional ideas of up and down seemed to lose meaning. He was the first human to truly see the deep ocean, not as a monster-haunted void, but as a living ecosystem, strange and beautiful and utterly unlike the surface world. Over the next 4 years, Beebe and Barton made 32 dives in the bathysphere, each descent pushing slightly deeper, revealing slightly more of the abyss. Their deepest dive in 1934 reached 3,028 feet, more than half a mile down. At that depth, the pressure reached more than 1,300 pounds per square inch. The sphere's walls compressed slightly under the weight of water. Any weakness in the metal, any flaw in the welding would have meant instant death. But Beebe wasn't primarily interested in setting depth records. He wanted to understand what lived in the deep ocean, to catalogue and describe creatures that science barely acknowledged existed. His dive logs read like field notes from an alien planet, detailing fish with fangs longer than their bodies, shrimp that exploded in clouds of luminescent fluid when disturbed, creatures so transparent they were nearly invisible except for their glowing organs. What's remarkable, looking back at Beebe's work, is how much he got right. His descriptions, made through small windows during brief descents, accurately captured the fundamental nature of deep-sea ecosystems. He understood that the creatures there relied on bioluminescence, producing their own light in a world without sun. He recognized that many deep-sea fish were smaller than expected, conserving energy in an environment where food was scarce. He noted the delicate, almost fragile nature of many creatures. Their bodies adapted to an environment where gravity mattered less because water provided support. The bathysphere had limitations. It could only go where the cable could lower it. It couldn't move horizontally, couldn't explore, couldn't do anything except hang in the water column while Beebe and Barton looked out through their small windows. But it proved something crucial. It demonstrated that humans could survive in the deep ocean, could go there and return, could bring back knowledge from a realm previously accessible only through imagination, and it raised a question that would drive ocean exploration for decades to come. If we could reach half a mile down in a simple steel sphere, how deep could we go? What existed in the deepest trenches, miles below the surface, where the pressure exceeded anything the bathysphere could withstand? The answer to that question would take nearly 30 years to discover, and would require an entirely different kind of vessel, designed not just to withstand pressure, but to move through it, to explore rather than simply descend and observe. On January 23, 1960, 2 men descended into the Challenger Deep, the deepest point in the world's oceans, reaching a depth of 35,814 feet. They stayed at the bottom for 20 minutes, then returned to the surface. It was one of the most remarkable achievements in the history of exploration, and for nearly 60 years afterward, no one repeated it. The vessel that carried them was the Trieste, a bathyscaphe designed by Swiss physicist Auguste Piccard and piloted by his son Jacques, accompanied by US Navy Lieutenant Don Walsh. Unlike Beebe's bathysphere, which hung from a cable, the Trieste could move under its own power, ascending and descending by adjusting its buoyancy. It consisted of a pressure sphere similar to Beebe's design but attached to a large float filled with gasoline, which is less dense than water and incompressible under pressure. The descent took nearly 5 hours, a slow drift through progressively darker water, as the Trieste dropped through zones oceanographers had named but barely explored. Through the sunlit zone, where light penetrates and photosynthesis occurs. Through the twilight zone, where light fades to a deep blue glow. Through the midnight zone, where darkness becomes absolute. And finally, into the abyss, where the Trieste's lights were the only illumination, a small bubble of human-made light descending through water that had been dark since the earth formed. Jacques Piccard's account of the descent describes a gradual transition from the familiar to the alien. In the upper zones, life was visible, recognizable, the fish and jellyfish and plankton that humans know from surface waters. Deeper, the creatures became stranger, bioluminescent, adapted to darkness. Deeper still, life became less visible, less frequent, more mysterious. And at the bottom, at a depth greater than Mount Everest is tall. They saw something that changed our understanding of life on Earth. They saw a flatfish, perhaps a foot long, lying on the sediment of the seafloor, a creature living at the greatest depth in the ocean, where the pressure exceeded 16,000 pounds per square inch, in water just above freezing, in complete darkness except for their lights. Living there not as some extremophile bacteria, not as some primitive organism barely clinging to existence, but as a complex vertebrate. A fish with a skeleton and organs and a brain, functioning perfectly in conditions that would instantly kill almost any other creature on the planet. That single observation proved something scientists had debated for decades. Life existed everywhere in the ocean. Everywhere. No depth was too great, no pressure too intense, no environment too extreme. If there was liquid water, there was likely life. Adapted to whatever conditions that water presented. The ocean floor wasn't a barren wasteland. It was habitat, as viable and vital as any other, home to communities of organisms we were only beginning to discover. Pickard and Walsh spent 20 minutes on the seafloor, observing, taking photographs, documenting their achievement. Then they dropped ballast and began the ascent, rising back through the zones they'd descended through, gradually returning to the surface and the world of sunlight and breathable air and pressure that human bodies could tolerate. The entire journey, descent and ascent combined, took nearly 9 hours. What's striking, reflecting on the Trieste's dive nearly 65 years later, is how little we've built on that achievement. Humans have been to the deepest part of the ocean exactly 4 times in manned vessels. 4 times. We've sent more people to the moon than to the bottom of our own ocean. The last manned dive to Challenger Deep occurred in 2020, 60 years after the first, when filmmaker James Cameron descended in a specially designed submersible, followed by a few more expeditions in subsequent years. The reason isn't lack of interest or courage. It's the fundamental challenge of the deep ocean. Every dive to extreme depths requires custom-built equipment, years of planning, enormous expense, and tremendous risk. The Trieste proved we could reach the deepest ocean, but reaching it and exploring it systematically are very different challenges. And yet what Pickard and Walsh proved matters enormously as we continue our journey into understanding the abyss. They demonstrated that the deep ocean wasn't empty, wasn't dead, wasn't the lifeless void that earlier generations had imagined. They showed us that our planet is entirely habitable, from the highest peaks to the deepest trenches, covered with life that has found ways to thrive in every possible niche. Which brings us naturally to ask what exactly that life looks like, how it survives, what it eats, how it finds mates, how it persists in an environment so seemingly hostile to existence itself. Light in the ocean is a limited resource. It penetrates the surface easily enough, refracting through the first few feet with the same bright clarity we see when swimming in shallow water. But water absorbs light, gradually, systematically, filtering out different wavelengths at different depths until, eventually, no light remains at all. The process happens in stages, creating distinct zones that oceanographers have named and studied for decades. The sunlit zone, called the epipelagic, extends from the surface down to roughly 650 feet. This is where photosynthesis occurs, where algae and plankton convert sunlight into energy, forming the base of the ocean's food web. It's the zone most familiar to humans, the realm of coral reefs and kelp forests, and the fish we recognize from aquariums and fishing boats. Below that lies the twilight zone, the mesopelagic, extending from roughly 650 feet to 3,300 feet. Sunlight reaches this zone, but not enough for photosynthesis. It's a realm of perpetual dim glow, where looking up you might see the faint shimmer of the surface, but looking down reveals only deepening darkness. Many creatures in this zone migrate upward at night, following the fading light to feed in the more productive waters above, then descending during the day to avoid predators. Below 3,300 feet, light effectively ceases to exist. This is the midnight zone, the bathypelagic, extending down to around 13,000 feet. No sunlight has penetrated to these depths for billions of years. If you extinguished every human-made light source in this zone, the darkness would be absolute, more complete than any darkness humans experience on land, where even on the darkest nights starlight provides some illumination. And yet, paradoxically, the midnight zone glows, not with sunlight, but with bioluminescence. Light produced by the creatures themselves through chemical reactions in specialized organs. Some estimates suggest that 90% of deep-sea creatures can produce their own light, making the midnight zone not dark but filled with living light, a constellation of glows and flashes and pulses, each with its own purpose. Understanding where sunlight ends is crucial to understanding everything else about the deep ocean. Because where photosynthesis ends, the fundamental basis of most ecosystems changes. Plants and photosynthetic organisms convert sunlight into chemical energy, which other organisms consume, which larger organisms consume in turn. Remove sunlight, and this entire system collapses. Deep-sea ecosystems can't rely on photosynthesis. They need a different energy source entirely. That source is simple, if grim. They rely on what falls from above. Dead organisms from the surface sinking through the water column. Fecal matter from animals feeding in sunlit waters. Molted shells and discarded tissue and fragments of larger creatures killed by predators. All of this organic matter drifts downward, slowly, steadily, a constant gentle rain of nutrients descending from the world above. Scientists call this marine snow, and it's the foundation of the deep ocean's energy budget. Without it, the abyss would be nearly lifeless. With it, entire ecosystems persist, feeding on the debris of the surface world, recycling nutrients, supporting communities of organisms that have never seen the sun and never will. This creates an interesting relationship between surface and deep ocean ecosystems. They're connected intimately by the flow of organic matter downward. Events in the surface ocean, changes in productivity, shifts in fish populations, all cascade downward eventually, affecting communities thousands of feet below. The ocean isn't layered like a cake, with separate independent levels. It's interconnected, dynamic, with matter and energy flowing between zones, in patterns we're still working to understand completely. But marine snow alone can't explain the richness of life in some parts of the deep ocean, particularly around features we'll explore later in our journey. There are places on the ocean floor where life thrives not on what falls from above but on energy from below, from the earth itself. Places where chemistry rather than photosynthesis drives entire ecosystems. These discoveries, relatively recent in the history of ocean science, fundamentally changed our understanding of where and how life can exist. For now, though, we're still descending, still moving through zones defined by the presence or absence of light. We've passed through the sunlit zone, through the twilight zone where some light lingers, and we're entering the midnight zone, where the only light comes from life itself. And in that darkness, remarkable things have evolved, adaptations so specialized and unusual that they challenge our assumptions about what life can do, what forms it can take. What's possible when the normal rules simply don't apply? Bioluminescence, the ability to produce light through chemical reactions, appears throughout the ocean but reaches its greatest diversity and sophistication in the deep sea. It's not a single trick used by a few species. It's a fundamental strategy employed by hundreds of different organisms, each using light in slightly different ways, for different purposes, solving different problems of survival in darkness. The mechanism is elegant in its chemistry. Most bioluminescent creatures combine a molecule called luciferin with an enzyme called luciferase, often in the presence of oxygen. The reaction produces light with very little heat. A cold light more efficient than any light bulb humans have invented. Different species use variations of this basic chemistry, producing lights in different colours, blues and greens and occasionally reds, each wavelength serving different functions in water that absorb some colours more than others. Some fish carry bioluminescent bacteria in specialised organs called photophores, maintaining colonies of glowing microbes in pouches along their bodies. It's a symbiotic relationship. The fish provides a home and nutrients for the bacteria. The bacteria provide light the fish can control, covering or uncovering the photophores to create patterns of illumination. Other creatures produce their own light directly, manufacturing the chemicals needed for bioluminescence in their own cells. The uses of bioluminescence are remarkably varied. Many deep-sea fish have patterns of lights on their undersides that match the faint downwelling light from above, making them invisible to predators looking up. It's called counter-illumination, and it's devastatingly effective. A fish lit from below to match the background glow of the surface essentially disappears, leaving no silhouette, no shadow, nothing for a predator's eyes to detect. Other creatures use light to hunt. The anglerfish, perhaps the most famous bioluminescent fish, suspends a glowing lure in front of its mouth, a modified spine tipped with bioluminescent bacteria. In the darkness, this light attracts smaller fish, curious or confused. Drawn to the only visible point of light in their dark world, they approach, and the anglerfish strikes, its enormous jaws closing on prey, lured by the false promise of light. Some deep-sea creatures use bioluminescence to communicate, flashing patterns that members of their own species recognize. These could be mating signals like fireflies in the summer night, or warnings, or territorial displays. We're still learning the language of these light patterns, still deciphering what messages deep-sea creatures convey to one another through their glows and flashes, and some use light as a defense, though in ways that seem almost impossibly clever. Certain squid and shrimp, when attacked, release clouds of bioluminescent fluid instead of ink. The glowing cloud distracts the predator, creates a target separate from the prey itself. While the predator investigates or attacks the glowing cloud, the squid swims away into darkness. It's a smoke bomb made of light, ephemeral, effective, beautiful in its own strange way. What's fascinating about bioluminescence in the deep ocean is how thoroughly it's replaced vision as we understand it. Many deep-sea fish have enormous eyes, far larger in proportion to their bodies than surface fish, evolved to capture every possible photon of light in an environment where light is precious. These eyes aren't looking for sunlight. They're looking for bioluminescence, watching for the telltale glow of prey, or predators, or potential mates. Some creatures have given up on seeing entirely. Below certain depths, eyes become useless, and evolution has reduced them or eliminated them completely. These fish navigate by other senses, by detecting chemical trails, by feeling pressure waves from swimming creatures, by methods we're still working to understand. They live in complete darkness, and for them, the concept of sight is irrelevant. But for the majority of deep-sea life, bioluminescence has created a new kind of vision, a new visual landscape. The deep ocean isn't dark to its inhabitants. It's lit by countless living lights, each creature broadcasting its presence or hiding it, hunting with light or fleeing from it, communicating through patterns we're only beginning to decode. To a deep-sea fish, the midnight zone might look something like a city at night looks to us, though the lights serve purposes we barely understand. This living light, this alternative to sunlight, represents one of evolution's most remarkable solutions to the problem of life in darkness. Instead of adapting to see in the dark, deep-sea creatures brought their own light, creating a visual environment where none should exist. They turned the disadvantage of darkness into an opportunity, using light as a tool, a weapon, a signal, a disguise. And in doing so, they created ecosystems as complex and interconnected as any lit by the sun, built not on photosynthesis, but on chemistry, on adaptation, on the remarkable flexibility of life to find solutions to whatever challenges an environment presents. We've discussed pressure abstractly, as numbers and atmospheres and pounds per square inch. But understanding how deep sea creatures survive that pressure requires thinking about bodies differently, about what makes a structure strong enough to resist being crushed when the entire ocean presses down from above. The key insight is this: pressure doesn't crush incompressible materials. A solid steel ball experiences the same pressure at depth as anything else, but it doesn't compress because steel, under those conditions, has nowhere to compress to. The molecules are already packed tightly. Similarly, water cannot be compressed significantly under ocean pressures. Pour a litre of water into a container and sink it to the deepest ocean. When you retrieve it, you'll still have a litre of water. Deep-sea creatures exploit this property brilliantly. Their bodies are mostly water, like all living things, but they've eliminated or modified the parts of their anatomy that contain compressible gases. Humans have air-filled lungs and sinuses. Deep-sea fish have no air bladders, no lungs, no gas-filled spaces anywhere in their bodies. Their swim bladders, which surface fish use to maintain buoyancy by adjusting gas volume, are either filled with incompressible lipids or absent entirely. This creates a body that's neutrally buoyant, neither floating up nor sinking down, existing in equilibrium with the surrounding pressure. A deep sea fish doesn't feel the pressure because there's nothing in its body for the pressure to act against. It's like asking if water at depth feels wet. The question doesn't quite make sense. The fish is part of the environment, adapted to it so thoroughly that the extreme pressure is simply normal. But eliminating gas-filled spaces is only part of the solution. Pressure affects proteins, the complex molecules that do most of the work in living cells. Under extreme pressure, proteins can denature, losing their shape and function, much like cooking changes the proteins in an egg. Deep-sea creatures have evolved special versions of proteins that remain stable under pressure, their molecular structures slightly modified to resist deformation. Some deep-sea organisms also produce organic compounds called piezolites, which counteract pressure's effects at the cellular level. These molecules stabilize proteins and membranes, helping them maintain their function under conditions that would destroy standard biochemistry. It's a molecular solution to a physical problem, chemistry compensating for physics. The result is creatures that look unusual to our eyes, adapted to their environment in ways that sometimes seem extreme. Many deep-sea fish have soft, almost gelatinous bodies, lacking the firm muscle mass of surface fish. They don't need powerful muscles for swimming because they're not fighting gravity in the same way. Water provides support. Their bones are often reduced, lighter, more cartilaginous, because strong skeletal support is less critical when you're suspended in water rather than standing against gravity. Some deep-sea creatures are nearly transparent, their bodies so lacking in dense tissue that they're almost invisible except for their internal organs. This transparency serves as camouflage in the deep ocean, where there's nothing to cast a shadow against, no background to blend into. Being invisible is better than being camouflaged, and near transparency achieves that. What's remarkable is how specialized these adaptations are. Deep-sea creatures cannot survive in surface waters, not because of the lack of pressure, but because their bodies are optimized for high pressure. Bring a deep-sea fish quickly to the surface, and the absence of supporting pressure causes problems. Their proteins may function poorly without pressure. Their bodies may expand. They're adapted to one environment so completely that they cannot function in another. This creates a kind of isolation, populations of deep-sea creatures separated from surface relatives by an environmental barrier as effective as any mountain range or desert. Over millions of years, this isolation has driven evolution in unusual directions, producing creatures that superficially resemble their surface cousins, but differ profoundly in their biochemistry and physiology. And it raises an interesting question about adaptability and environment. We tend to think of Earth's surface as the normal environment and deep sea as extreme. But to a deep sea fish, the surface is extreme. Low pressure, bright light, warmer temperatures, all of these are inhospitable, dangerous, impossible to survive in. Normal is whatever environment a creature evolved in, and for much of the ocean's life, normal is dark, cold, and pressurized beyond human tolerance. Understanding these adaptations helps us appreciate not just how life survives in the deep ocean, but how thoroughly it's adapted to conditions we find extreme. The abyss isn't barely inhabited, it's fully inhabited, populated by creatures as well suited to their environment as birds are to air, as fish are to water, as humans are to the thin slice of atmosphere and land we call home. Temperature in the deep ocean is remarkably stable and remarkably cold. In most of the world's deep ocean, temperature hovers between 32 and 39 degrees Fahrenheit, just above freezing, maintained at this low temperature by water that sank at the poles and spread along the ocean floor, carrying its chill with it across the globe. This cold is different from the cold we experience on land. It's constant, unvarying, the same temperature year-round, decade after decade, century after century. Deep-sea creatures never experience seasonal change, never feel the water warm in summer or cool in winter. The temperature they live in is the temperature their ancestors lived in millions of years ago, and the temperature their descendants will live in millions of years hence, assuming nothing catastrophic alters the ocean's circulation patterns. Cold water has properties that affect life profoundly. It's denser than warm water, which is why cold water sinks at the poles and flows along the ocean bottom. It holds more dissolved oxygen than warm water, which is fortunate because deep-sea creatures need that oxygen, extracting it from the water with gills, much like their surface relatives, and it slows metabolism, reducing the rate at which chemical reactions occur, which has profound implications for how quickly deep-sea creatures live their lives. Many deep-sea fish grow slowly, reproducing slowly, living longer than their surface counterparts. A species of rockfish found in deep waters off California can live more than 200 years, becoming sexually mature only after decades of growth. This slow life history is partly a response to cold, which reduces metabolic rate, and partly a response to food scarcity, which we'll explore more deeply in a moment. But some deep-sea creatures have adapted to cold in more active ways. They've evolved antifreeze proteins in their blood and tissues, molecules that prevent ice crystals from forming even when water temperature drops below the normal freezing point of their bodily fluids. These proteins work by binding to tiny ice crystals as they begin to form, preventing them from growing larger. It's a molecular solution to a physical problem, allowing fish to survive in water, cold enough to freeze them solid without this protection. The stability of temperature in the deep ocean has another effect worth contemplating. It means deep-sea creatures don't need to adapt to variable conditions. Evolution has optimized them for one temperature, one set of conditions, allowing specialization that would be impossible in more variable environments. A creature that must survive both summer heat and winter cold needs to be generalized, flexible, able to adjust. A creature that lives its entire life at 35 degrees Fahrenheit can become exquisitely adapted to exactly that temperature, with no need to tolerate variation. This specialization makes deep-sea creatures potentially vulnerable to change, though change in the deep ocean occurs on timescales far longer than human lifetimes. If ocean circulation patterns shift, if the temperature of deep water changes even slightly, creatures that have evolved over millions of years to function at one specific temperature might struggle to adapt. They've traded flexibility for optimization, which works beautifully as long as conditions remain stable. There's something almost peaceful about this stability, if we pause to consider it. While surface organisms experience daily temperature swings, seasonal changes, heat waves and cold snaps, deep-sea creatures exist in what might be the most stable environment on Earth. The same temperature, the same pressure, the same darkness, unchanging year after year. It's not monotonous to them. It's simply their environment, as normal and unremarkable to a deep-sea fish as our variable weather is to us. And this stability extends beyond temperature. Salinity in the deep ocean varies little. chemical composition remains constant. Even the sediment on the seafloor accumulates so slowly that the landscape changes only over geological time. A deep-sea creature could theoretically settle in one spot and remain there for years, even decades, experiencing essentially the same conditions day after day. This doesn't mean the deep ocean is static or boring. Plenty happens there, events we'll explore in coming chapters. But those events occur against a background of profound stability, change happening within an environment that itself rarely changes. It's a different kind of ecosystem, governed by different rules, operating on different timescales, and the combination of cold, pressure, and darkness creates conditions that seem hostile from a human perspective, but are simply normal for creatures evolved to live there. The deep ocean isn't a harsh environment struggling to support life. It's a stable environment supporting life that's perfectly adapted to its conditions, thriving in ways we're only beginning to understand. Which brings us gently to one of the most challenging aspects of deep-sea life, and one that shapes everything about how these ecosystems function: the scarcity of food. Food, in the deep ocean, is scarce in ways difficult to overstate. Remember that sunlight, and therefore photosynthesis, ends around 650 feet below the surface. Below that, no primary production occurs. No energy enters the system from the sun. The only food available is what drifts down from above, the marine snow we discussed earlier, and the larger carcasses that occasionally sink into the abyss. The amount of organic matter that reaches the deep sea floor is tiny compared to what's produced at the surface. Estimates suggest that less than 5% of organic matter created in surface waters eventually settles to the deep ocean floor. The rest is consumed during its descent by creatures in the twilight zone and midnight zone, each layer extracting nutrition from the falling debris until little remains for the deepest depths. This scarcity shapes everything about deep sea life. Evolution has produced creatures that can survive on minimal food intake, that can go weeks or months between meals, that have reduced their metabolic requirements to the bare minimum necessary to sustain life. Many deep sea fish are small, reducing their energy needs. They have large mouths and expandable stomachs, able to consume prey larger than themselves when the opportunity arises, storing food against future scarcity. Some deep sea fish look almost comical to our eyes, with bodies that seem too small for their enormous heads and mouths. But this body plan makes perfect sense in an environment where encounters with prey are rare and unpredictable. If you don't know when your next meal might appear, you need the ability to eat whatever you encounter, regardless of size, and store that meal efficiently. The scarcity of food has driven evolution toward remarkable patience. Many deep-sea predators are ambush hunters, sitting motionless for extended periods, conserving energy, waiting for prey to wander within range. Movement in the deep ocean costs energy, and energy is the most precious resource. Better to wait, patient and still, than to swim actively hunting for prey that might not exist in any direction you choose. This creates an interesting paradox. The deep ocean, which covers such vast areas of the planet, has relatively low biomass compared to surface waters. There's a lot of space, but not many organisms occupying it. Population densities are low. Encounters between individuals of the same species can be rare, which creates challenges for reproduction that we'll explore later in our journey. But occasionally, the deep ocean receives windfalls of food that transform local ecosystems temporarily. When a whale dies and sinks to the seafloor, it brings tons of organic matter to the abyss all at once, more food than most deep-sea creatures encounter in their entire lives. These whale falls, as they're called, become temporary oases of abundance, attracting scavengers from surprisingly large areas. Scientists have studied whale falls using submersibles and found them supporting complex communities that exist nowhere else. First come the mobile scavengers, sharks and hagfish and crabs, consuming the soft tissue within weeks or months. Then come worms and crustaceans that colonize the skeleton, feeding on oils in the bones. Finally come bacteria that break down the remaining organic matter, supporting their own unique ecosystems that can persist for decades. A single whale fall can support life at a deep sea site for 50 years or more, an extraordinary legacy for a creature that lived its life in surface waters and only contributed to the deep ocean in death. These events are rare but significant, punctuating the general scarcity of the abyss with temporary abundance that shapes community structure in ways we're still working to understand. The scarcity of food in the deep ocean reminds us that life requires energy, and energy in most ecosystems ultimately comes from the sun. The deep ocean is one of the few places on Earth where this isn't entirely true, where other energy sources we'll discuss later can support life. But for most of the abyss, survival means existing on scraps from the world above, making do with little, adapting to scarcity as a fundamental condition of existence. There's a kind of resilience in this, a testament to life's ability to persist even where resources are minimal. The deep sea isn't easy. But easy isn't a requirement for life. Only possibility is required, only the bare minimum of conditions necessary for biochemistry to function. And given those minimal conditions, life finds ways not just to survive but to diversify, to specialize, to create ecosystems as complex as those in more resource-rich environments. Which brings us to perhaps the strangest ecosystems in the deep ocean, places where energy comes not from above but from below, from the Earth itself. Through chemistry so unusual it rewrote our understanding of where life can exist. In 1977, scientists exploring the Galapagos Rift aboard the submersible Alvin discovered something that shouldn't have existed. At a depth of around 8,000 feet, in water just above freezing in complete darkness, they found dense communities of life clustered around cracks in the seafloor, feeding not on marine snow from above, but on chemicals flowing from the Earth itself. These were hydrothermal vents, fissures where seawater seeps into the ocean crust, becomes superheated by magma chambers below, and erupts back into the ocean carrying dissolved minerals and chemicals. The water emerging from some vents reaches temperatures exceeding 700 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt lead, though it doesn't boil because the pressure at depth prevents it from transitioning to gas. Around these vents lived creatures found nowhere else on Earth, tube worms as tall as a person, with bright red plumes extended into the water, clams the size of dinner plates, white crabs clustering in groups of hundreds, shrimp swarming in the warm water near the vents. All of this teeming life in one of the most remote and inhospitable places on the planet, where conventional wisdom suggested only sparse populations should exist. The discovery was revolutionary, not just because these communities existed, but because of how they derived their energy. At the base of the food web weren't plants or photosynthetic organisms, but bacteria that metabolized chemicals in the vent fluids, particularly hydrogen sulfide, a compound toxic to most life. These bacteria performed chemosynthesis instead of photosynthesis, extracting energy from chemical bonds rather than from sunlight. The tube worms had evolved an even more remarkable solution. They had no mouth, no digestive system, no way to eat in the conventional sense. Instead, they hosted chemosynthetic bacteria inside their bodies, in a specialized organ called a trophosome. The worm absorbed hydrogen sulfide and oxygen from the water, provided them to the bacteria, and the bacteria produced organic compounds that fed the worm. It was a symbiotic relationship as intimate as any in biology, a creature that had externalized its metabolism to bacteria, living as a host to its own food factory. This discovery fundamentally changed our understanding of life's requirements. Scientists had always assumed that life on Earth ultimately depended on the sun, that photosynthesis was the foundation of all ecosystems. But here was life thriving on chemical energy alone, in complete darkness, independent of the sun. If life could exist on chemical energy from hydrothermal vents, perhaps it could exist anywhere those chemicals were available. Even on other planets or moons without sunlight. The discovery also revealed how little we knew about the deep ocean. Hydrothermal vents were first theorized in the 1960s, but finding them required developing submersibles capable of reaching the deep seafloor and searching systematically. After 1977, scientists began finding vents in oceans worldwide, each supporting its own unique community of organisms, some overlapping with other vent sites, some entirely endemic. These communities exist in patches, oases scattered across the deep ocean floor at sites where geological conditions permit venting. Between vent sites, the seafloor returns to the sparse populations typical of the abyss. This creates a patchy distribution of life, high-density communities separated by what might be hundreds of miles of low-density seafloor. For creatures that live only at vents, this patchiness creates evolutionary isolation. Populations separated from each other with limited gene flow, driving rapid speciation and diversification. What's beautiful about hydrothermal vent ecosystems is how they demonstrate life's opportunism, its ability to exploit any available energy source. The Earth provides heat and chemicals through geological processes. Bacteria evolve to harness that energy. Other organisms evolve to exploit those bacteria, building food webs as complex as any based on photosynthesis. Given an energy source and liquid water, life finds a way. The vents also taught scientists humility about Earth's habitability. For most of human history, we assumed we understood the limits of where life could exist. Too hot? Life couldn't survive. Too cold? Life couldn't survive. No sunlight? Life couldn't survive. Hydrothermal vents violated all those assumptions. Life existed at temperatures that should denature proteins, in darkness that should preclude food webs, under pressures that should crush complex organisms. It existed because it had adapted, because evolution had found solutions to every challenge those conditions presented. And if life could exist at hydrothermal vents on Earth, thriving in conditions once thought impossible, where else might life exist? On Europa, Jupiter's moon beneath ice sheets covering a global ocean? On Enceladus, Saturn's moon, where geysers hint at liquid water below? The discovery of vent communities expanded not just our understanding of Earth, but our imagination about life in the universe. Hydrothermal vents aren't the only places where chemicals from the Earth support deep-sea ecosystems. There are also cold seeps, sites where methane and other hydrocarbons leak slowly from the seafloor, providing energy for communities built on chemistry rather than sunlight. Cold seeps are quieter than vents, less dramatic, but equally remarkable in their own way. Methane is a simple molecule, one carbon atom bonded to 4 hydrogen atoms, but in the deep ocean it becomes a fuel for life. Certain bacteria can metabolize methane, oxidizing it using sulfate from seawater, producing hydrogen sulfide and organic compounds in the process. Other bacteria then use that hydrogen sulfide, creating a food web built on methane from below and sulfate from the surrounding water. The communities at cold seeps resemble vent communities in some ways. There are tube worms, though different species than those at vents. There are clams and mussels, all hosting symbiotic bacteria that provide their nutrition. There are bacterial mats covering the sediment, visible as white or orange films where methane-metabolizing microbes flourish. The whole ecosystem exists in a slow-motion version of the vent community's more dynamic energy flow. What makes cold seeps particularly interesting is how widespread they might be. Hydrothermal vents occur at specific geological settings, primarily along mid-ocean ridges and subduction zones where tectonic activity creates the conditions for venting. Cold seeps can occur anywhere methane accumulates beneath the seafloor and finds pathways to leak out. This includes continental margins, sites of ancient organic matter burial, and areas where methane hydrates, ice-like compounds of methane and water, destabilize and release gas. Scientists estimate that cold seeps might be far more common than hydrothermal vents, though they're harder to find because they don't create the same temperature anomalies or dramatic plumes that make vents detectable from submersibles. A cold seep looks, from a distance, like ordinary seafloor, revealed only by closer inspection that shows unusual communities clustered around what appear to be unremarkable patches of sediment. The methane at cold seeps comes from two sources. Some is produced by microbes deep in the sediment, converting organic matter into methane through decomposition. This is called biogenic methane, biological in origin. Other methane is thermogenic, produced by heat and pressure acting on deeply buried organic matter over millions of years. Essentially the same process that creates natural gas and oil. Both types seep upward through sediment, sometimes reaching the seafloor, sometimes becoming trapped as methane hydrates in the cold, high-pressure conditions of deep sediment. Methane hydrates represent an enormous reservoir of carbon, perhaps exceeding all other fossil fuel deposits combined. They're stable only at specific combinations of temperature and pressure, existing in a narrow zone beneath the seafloor and in permafrost regions on land. Climate scientists monitor methane hydrates with some concern because warming temperatures could destabilize them, releasing methane into the ocean and atmosphere, where it acts as a potent greenhouse gas. But that's a story for another discussion, one about climate rather than life. For now, what matters is how methane seeping from the seafloor supports ecosystems that would otherwise struggle to exist in the food-poor deep ocean. These ecosystems don't depend on what falls from above. They create their own food from chemicals below, independent of the surface world's productivity, isolated from seasonal variations in surface production, sustained by geological processes that operate on timescales of millions of years. The organisms at cold seeps face interesting challenges beyond just surviving on methane-based food webs. Methane and hydrogen sulfide are both toxic to many organisms. Yet the creatures at seeps not only tolerate these compounds but require them. Their symbiotic bacteria need these chemicals to generate energy. Remove the seep, and the community collapses, unable to obtain food from the sparse marine snow that sustains other deep-sea life. This dependence creates vulnerability. Seeps aren't permanent features. They can become plugged with sediment, or the methane source can be depleted, or geological shift can redirect the flow of gas. When a seep stops seeping, the community there dies out, unable to persist without its chemical energy source. But somewhere else, a new seep may open, and larvae drifting through the deep ocean may colonize it, establishing a new community in a new location, continuing the cycle of dependence on chemical energy from below. What cold seeps teach us, alongside hydrothermal vents, is that the deep ocean contains multiple types of ecosystems, powered by different energy sources supporting different communities. The ocean floor isn't uniform. It's a mosaic of different environments, each with its own characteristics, challenges, and forms of life, adapted to exploit whatever resources are available. And this diversity, this patchiness, this variation in what exists where, makes the deep ocean endlessly fascinating and difficult to understand completely without exploring far more of it than we've managed so far. Not all features of the deep ocean floor are flat abyssal plains or chemically fueled oases. Rising from the seafloor around the world are seamounts, underwater mountains that can tower thousands of feet above the surrounding bottom. Some reaching close enough to the surface to create shallow water habitats, others remaining entirely submerged in the dark zones of the deep ocean. Most seamounts are volcanic in origin, created when magma pushes through the ocean crust, building mountains that sometimes breach the surface as islands but often remain hidden beneath the waves. The Pacific Ocean contains thousands of seamounts, perhaps tens of thousands, most unmapped, many undiscovered. A vast mountainous landscape hidden beneath water where humans rarely venture. Seamounts alter ocean currents in ways that create unique habitats. When deep ocean currents encounter a seamount, they're forced upward, creating what oceanographers call Taylor columns, rotating currents that can trap nutrients and organisms, creating zones of enhanced productivity around the mountain. Plankton and other small organisms accumulate in these currents, unable to escape the rotating water, and larger organisms gather to feed on them. This makes seamounts hotspots of biodiversity in the deep ocean. Surveys of seamounts have found them supporting communities of corals, sponges, fish, and other organisms at densities far higher than the surrounding abyssal plains. A single seamount might host hundreds of species, some found nowhere else, endemic to that specific mountain, isolated from others by expanses of flat seafloor. The corals on seamounts are different from the reef-building corals we know from shallow tropical waters. These are deep-sea corals, existing without sunlight, without symbiotic algae to provide food through photosynthesis. They feed by filtering particles from the water, extending their polyps to capture marine snow and small swimming organisms. Some grow extremely slowly, adding perhaps a millimetre per year, living for centuries or even millennia. These ancient corals build structures that provide habitat for other organisms. Fish hide among coral branches. Crustaceans crawl over coral surfaces. Predators hunt in the three-dimensional landscape the corals create. Remove the corals and the diversity collapses, the fish and crustaceans and other organisms losing the structure they depend on for shelter and hunting grounds. Unfortunately, seamounts face threats from human activities, particularly bottom trawling, a fishing method that drags heavy nets across the seafloor to catch fish. When trawls pass over seamounts, they destroy the slow-growing corals, reducing complex three-dimensional habitats to flattened rubble. Recovery, if it occurs at all, takes centuries, far longer than the hours or days it took to cause the damage. Beyond their ecological importance, seamounts represent geological puzzles. Some formed over hotspots, regions where plumes of hot mantle material rise toward the surface, creating chains of volcanoes as tectonic plates move over them. The Hawaiian Islands are the surface expression of one such chain, but beneath the waves the chain continues, a line of seamounts stretching across the Pacific, each mountain representing a moment when the Pacific plate was positioned over the Hawaiian hotspot. Other seamounts are older, extinct volcanoes from earlier geological periods, their peaks sometimes flattened by erosion when they were islands, now submerged as tectonic plates have subsided or sea levels have changed. These flat-topped seamounts, called guyots, are time capsules, preserving evidence of past sea levels and tectonic movements in their shapes and the sediments that cover them. What's remarkable about seamounts is how they demonstrate that the ocean floor isn't a featureless plain but a landscape as varied as any on land. There are mountains and valleys, ridges and trenches, plateaus and basins. We simply cannot see this landscape easily because it's hidden beneath miles of water, revealed only through sonar mapping and the patient work of ships crisscrossing the ocean, measuring depths, creating bathymetric maps that show the hidden topography. And with every new seamount discovered and surveyed, scientists find new species, new communities, new variations on the themes of deep-sea life. Some seamounts host communities similar to others nearby. Some are unique, isolated by currents or distance or depth, in ways that have allowed evolution to take different paths. Each is its own experiment in how life adapts to specific conditions, specific depths, specific current patterns. The ocean floor contains, by some estimates, over 100,000 seamounts. We've studied perhaps a few hundred in any detail. The rest remain largely unknown, their communities unsampled, their species uncatalogued, their role in ocean ecosystems poorly understood. They represent not just geological features but entire ecosystems waiting to be discovered, mountains holding secrets we haven't yet revealed. And this brings us to contemplate how much of the ocean floor remains not just unmapped but unexplored. How many seamounts exist without names? How many communities thrive without human awareness, living their lives in darkness, untouched and unknown? The deepest places in the ocean are trenches, long, narrow canyons where one tectonic plate slides beneath another in the geological process called subduction. These trenches represent the deepest points on Earth's surface, places where the ocean floor drops away into chasms miles deep, creating environments where pressure and depth reach their maximum values. The Mariana Trench in the Western Pacific is the deepest, with the Challenger Deep reaching down nearly 11,000 meters, almost 7 miles below sea level. If you could place Mount Everest at the bottom of the Challenger Deep, its peak would still be covered by more than a mile of water. That's the scale of these trenches, depths so profound they challenge our ability to visualize them. Other trenches circle the Pacific in what's called the Ring of Fire, regions of active tectonics where earthquakes and volcanic eruptions occur regularly. The Japan Trench, the Peru-Chile Trench, the Tonga Trench, each represents a collision zone between tectonic plates, places where the Earth's crust bends and breaks, creating these deep wounds in the ocean floor. Life exists in the trenches, though in forms adapted to the most extreme conditions on Earth. We've already mentioned the fish Picard and Walsh saw at Challenger Deep. Since then, scientists have found other creatures in various trenches, amphipods, shrimp-like crustaceans that can reach surprisingly large sizes in the deep trenches, some growing to nearly a foot long. These amphipods are scavengers, feeding on whatever organic matter settles into the trenches, taking advantage of a niche where few predators exist. The trenches act as traps for organic matter. Material sinking through the water column tends to accumulate in these deep basins, creating food sources that support larger populations than the surrounding abyssal plains. Camera systems lowered into trenches have recorded surprising amounts of activity, fish swimming past, crustaceans crawling across sediment, even larger creatures visiting from shallower depths to feed on whatever accumulates in these deep canyons. But trenches also represent zones of geological activity that can be dangerous for any life present. Subduction generates earthquakes as plates grind against each other. These earthquakes can trigger underwater landslides, sending sediment cascading down trench walls, potentially burying any creatures in its path. The movement of tectonic plates can also create zones of elevated heat, where subducting crust carries water downward, potentially creating unique chemical environments we're only beginning to explore. Scientists have found evidence that trenches may contain unique ecosystems similar to, but distinct from hydrothermal vents and cold seeps. The subduction process can create pathways for fluids to migrate, potentially supporting chemosynthetic communities. Some trenches show elevated levels of certain chemicals that could support life independent of surface productivity. But exploring trenches is challenging, requiring specialized equipment capable of withstanding extreme pressure, making comprehensive surveys difficult. What we know about trench ecosystems comes from a relatively small number of dives and camera deployments. Each expedition reveals new species, new behaviors, new ecological relationships. Scientists have found fish species endemic to specific trenches, snailfish that exist nowhere else, adapted to the pressure and conditions of their particular deep canyon. These discoveries suggest that trenches aren't uniform but contain distinct communities, each trench potentially hosting unique assemblages of life. The sediments in trenches also preserve information about Earth's history. Because trenches are ultimate collection points, organic matter and inorganic particles settling from above accumulate in layers that can be sampled and analysed. These sediment cores reveal past climate conditions, variations in ocean productivity, events like massive volcanic eruptions or asteroid impacts that left layers of distinctive material. In this way, trenches serve dual purposes in our understanding of Earth. Their habitats supporting unique life adapted to extreme conditions, and their archives, preserving records of planetary history in their sediments, waiting for scientists with the technology and patience to sample them and read the stories they contain. But perhaps what's most striking about trenches is how few people have visited them. The deepest point on Earth has been reached by humans perhaps 4 times, fewer people than have walked on the moon. This isn't because of lack of interest, but because of the sheer difficulty of reaching these depths, surviving the pressure, and returning safely to the surface. Every trench represents a frontier, a place where our knowledge remains fragmentary, where most of what exists remains undiscovered. And while we've made remarkable progress in understanding these deep environments, we've barely scratched the surface, or in this case, barely touched the bottom of what there is to learn. Which leads us to reflect on what these discoveries in trenches, at seamounts, around vents and seeps have taught us about the diversity of deep sea life, and about how much remains unknown in the vast dark ocean. Below 6,000 metres, roughly 20,000 feet, begins the Hadal zone, named after Hades, the ancient Greek underworld. This is the deepest zone in the ocean, found only in trenches and the deepest abyssal plains, representing less than 2% of the ocean floor by area, but reaching depths where pressure exceeds 600 atmospheres. The Hadal zone was long thought to be essentially lifeless, too deep and extreme for complex life. But as we've explored trenches more systematically, we've found that assumption was wrong. The Hadal zone hosts unique communities, species found nowhere else, adapted specifically to the enormous pressure and other conditions of the deepest ocean. Among the most remarkable Hadal creatures are the snailfish, a family of fish that includes the deepest living fish ever recorded. In the Mariana Trench, scientists have filmed snailfish swimming at depths exceeding 8,000 metres, more than 26,000 feet below the surface. These fish are small, delicate-looking, with translucent skin and bodies that appear almost gelatinous. They move slowly, conserving energy, feeding on small invertebrates in the sediment. What's extraordinary about these fish is how they survive pressure that would crush most organisms. They've evolved proteins and cellular structures that function normally under extreme pressure. Their bones are small and flexible, reducing the structural support they need. Their bodies contain compounds that counteract pressure's effects at the molecular level, allowing their cells to maintain function even when the ocean presses down with more than 8 tons per square inch. Scientists studying these fish have found that there may be a depth limit for fish, somewhere around 8,400 metres, beyond which the pressure prevents the proteins fish use from functioning, even with adaptations. Below this depth, life might exist only in simpler forms, invertebrates, microbes, organisms with different biochemistry that can function under even greater pressure. The Hadal zone also hosts amphipods, those shrimp-like crustaceans we mentioned earlier, which reach impressive sizes in the deep trenches. While surface amphipods might measure a few millimetres, Hadal amphipods can exceed 30 centimetres, more than a foot long. These giants are scavengers, feeding on carcasses that sink into the trenches, playing a role similar to vultures on land, cleaning up organic matter and returning nutrients to the ecosystem. Finding food in the Hadal zone is challenging. Marine snow falls there eventually, but in small amounts, having been filtered through thousands of meters of water, where other organisms have already consumed most of the nutrition. Larger food falls, dead fish, squid, whales, are rare but significant when they occur, attracting scavengers from large areas, creating temporary feeding frenzies in the usually sparse Hadal environment. Scientists have deployed baited cameras in trenches, using fish carcasses as bait to attract Hadal creatures. These cameras have revealed remarkable feeding behaviours. Amphipods swarm over bait in hours, stripping it clean in what looks like a slow-motion feeding frenzy. Fish appear, cautious, taking bites before swimming back into the darkness. The activity around bait suggests that food finding in the Hadal zone relies heavily on chemical senses, on detecting gradients of scent in the water and following them to their source. What we're learning about Hadal ecosystems challenges assumptions about the limits of complex life. These aren't marginal environments barely supporting a few extremophiles. They're functioning ecosystems with predators and prey, scavengers and microbes, food webs and energy flow. They're different from surface ecosystems, certainly, adapted to extreme conditions, but they're not simplified or reduced. They're complete systems, as complex in their way as ecosystems anywhere else. The Hadal zone also represents a zone of isolation, Because of the extreme depth, creatures from shallower zones rarely venture into Hadal depths, and Hadal creatures cannot survive in shallower water. This creates barriers to gene flow, isolating populations in different trenches from each other, driving evolution in different directions, creating endemic species found in only one trench, or sometimes only one part of one trench. As we map and explore more trenches, we keep finding new species, new adaptations, new variations on the theme of life under extreme pressure. Each trench is its own experiment in evolution, populations isolated for millions of years developing their own solutions to the challenges of Hadal life. And because we've explored so few trenches in any detail, most of this diversity remains undiscovered, swimming and crawling and feeding in darkness, unknown to science, living lives that have never intersected with human awareness. There's something almost humbling about that, contemplating creatures that exist entirely independent of human knowledge, in environments so remote and challenging that we can visit them only briefly, in specially designed vessels, at great expense and effort, while they live there constantly, as naturally as we live in air and sunlight. We began this journey by acknowledging that most of the ocean floor remains unmapped in any detailed way, understood only through approximate measurements and interpolations. As we've descended through zones and explored different ecosystems, perhaps you've wondered why this remains true, why we haven't simply mapped the entire ocean floor and settled the question of what exists where. The answer lies partly in the sheer scale of the task and partly in the economics and priorities that drive ocean exploration. The ocean covers 361 million square kilometres. To map that area with sonar to a resolution of 100 metres, the current standard for detailed mapping would require ships travelling back and forth across every square kilometre, a process that would take decades even with multiple vessels working simultaneously. The cost would be substantial. Research vessels capable of deep ocean mapping cost hundreds of thousands of dollars per day to operate, when you account for the ship itself, fuel, crew, scientists, equipment maintenance, and all the other expenses of ocean research. Mapping the entire ocean floor to high resolution might cost billions of dollars, funds that would need to come from governments or international organizations, competing with other priorities for limited budgets. There's also the question of what such mapping would reveal. Most of the ocean floor is abyssal plain, relatively flat sediment-covered landscape, extending for thousands of miles with little variation. Mapping it in detail would confirm its flatness, would add precision to our measurements, but might not reveal dramatic new features or fundamentally change our understanding of ocean geology. The most interesting features, seamounts, trenches, ridges, volcanic zones, can be detected with existing lower resolution methods, allowing researchers to focus detailed mapping efforts on areas likely to yield interesting discoveries. This creates a practical approach to ocean mapping. Scientists use satellite measurements to create rough maps of the entire ocean floor, identifying major features and areas that warrant closer investigation. Then they deploy ships with high-resolution sonar to survey those specific areas in detail, creating maps that reveal individual rocks and small-scale features. It's a triage approach, focusing resources where they're most likely to produce meaningful results. But this approach means that vast areas of ocean floor remain known only approximately. There could be seamounts in unmapped regions that we simply haven't detected yet, seamounts that might host unique communities. There could be unusual geological features, hydrothermal vent fields, cold seep sites, all waiting to be discovered in regions where ships haven't yet travelled with high-resolution sonar. The mapping situation is gradually improving. An international initiative called Seabed 2030 aims to produce a complete map of the ocean floor by the year 2030, compiling data from all available sources and coordinating efforts to map remaining unmapped areas. Autonomous underwater vehicles are making mapping more efficient, able to survey large areas without requiring constant human oversight. New technologies are improving sonar resolution and reducing the time needed to map a given area. And yet, even if we successfully map every square kilometre of ocean floor to current standards, we still won't have truly explored the ocean. Maps show topography, the shape of the seafloor, the locations of features. They don't show what lives there, what ecosystems exist, what species inhabit different environments. To understand that requires more than mapping. It requires sampling, observation, studying communities in their habitats, work that's far more time-consuming than simply measuring depth. This distinction between mapping and exploring is important to understand as we contemplate the unknown ocean. We could theoretically map the entire ocean floor within a few decades given sufficient resources and coordination. But truly exploring it, understanding its ecosystems, cataloguing its species, comprehending its geological processes and biological communities, that would take far longer, perhaps centuries of sustained effort. Consider that on land, where access is relatively easy, scientists are still discovering new species, still finding unexplored caves and canyons, still making basic observations about ecosystems they thought they understood. In the ocean, where access is difficult and expensive, where most areas can be visited only briefly using specialized equipment, comprehensive exploration faces challenges that make mapping look simple by comparison. So when we say 95% of the ocean remains unexplored, we're not just talking about mapping. We're talking about the deep, sustained observation necessary to understand how ocean ecosystems function, how species interact, how geological processes shape the seafloor, how currents and chemistry and temperature and pressure combine to create conditions where specific communities can exist. We're talking about understanding, not just measuring, a much higher standard than simple cartography. And this brings us to contemplate what might exist in those unexplored regions, what discoveries might wait in the unmapped areas, what species might live their entire evolutionary histories without ever encountering human observation, until someday, perhaps, a submersible arrives and illuminates them briefly before moving on. We've spoken much about darkness in the deep ocean, about how light fades and disappears, leaving creatures to navigate by bioluminescence or abandon vision entirely. But the deep ocean isn't silent. Sound travels through water far better than through air, carrying across distances that would be impossible on land, creating an acoustic environment rich with information for creatures that have evolved to listen. Underwater, sound moves at roughly 1,500 meters per second, nearly 5 times faster than sound in air, and travels farther before dissipating. Low-frequency sounds can travel thousands of miles through the ocean, crossing entire basins, detectable by any creature with hearing sensitive enough to pick them up. This makes sound an ideal medium for communication, navigation, and sensing in the deep ocean where other senses are limited. Whales have evolved to use this property of water brilliantly. Blue whales produce calls at frequencies so low humans can barely hear them, sounds that travel across entire ocean basins, potentially allowing whales separated by thousands of miles to communicate. These long-distance communications might coordinate migration, advertise reproductive readiness, or maintain social connections across vast distances. We're still learning how whales use these capabilities, still deciphering the meaning of their complex vocalizations. But surface-dwelling whales aren't the only creatures using sound in the ocean. Many deep-sea fish produce sounds, clicking and grunting through mechanisms that vary by species. Some use their swim bladders as resonating chambers, vibrating them to produce sounds. Others grind teeth or specialized bones together, creating noises that carry through the water. The purposes of these sounds aren't always clear, but likely include communication, territory defense, and mate attraction. Shrimp, particularly snapping shrimp, create some of the loudest sounds in the ocean, snapping their claws shut so rapidly they create cavitation bubbles that collapse with sharp cracks. Individual snaps are loud enough to stun small fish. Collectively, colonies of snapping shrimp create background noise that can interfere with sonar and underwater communications. It's a reminder that what seems silent to us, without specialized equipment to hear it, actually contains a constant chorus of biological sounds. The deep ocean has its own acoustic characteristics that affect how sound propagates. Temperature and pressure create layers where sound bends and channels, traveling horizontally through specific depths rather than spreading evenly in all directions. These sound channels, particularly the deep sound channel located at depths where sound speed reaches a minimum, can trap and propagate sounds across entire ocean basins with minimal loss of energy. Military applications recognized this property decades ago, using hydrophones to listen for submarines in the deep sound channel, detecting vessels thousands of miles away. But the same channels that carry submarine sounds also carry biological sounds, creating highways of acoustic information available to any creature with appropriate hearing sensitivity. We're only beginning to understand how deep-sea creatures might use these sound channels, whether they listen to distant events, communicate across long distances, or navigate by acoustic landmarks. There are also natural sounds in the deep ocean beyond those produced by living creatures. Underwater volcanoes rumble and crack as magma rises and cools. Icebergs calving from glaciers create tremendous cracking sounds that travel across ocean basins. Earthquakes generate acoustic waves that propagate through water, potentially detectable by organisms sensitive to these frequencies. The ocean contains a soundscape of geological events, weather phenomena, and ice dynamics, all creating acoustic information that creatures might potentially use. Humans have added our own sounds to the ocean, often with little consideration for how those sounds affect marine life. Ship propellers create constant noise along shipping lanes. Sonar systems used for navigation and military purposes emit powerful pulses that can disorient or harm some species. Underwater construction, seismic surveys for oil and gas, industrial activities along coasts, all contribute to an increasing background of human-generated noise that overlays the natural soundscape. This anthropogenic noise can interfere with marine mammals' communication, potentially separating mothers from calves, disrupting migration patterns, or making it difficult for whales to find mates across long distances. It's a form of pollution we're only beginning to understand and regulate, sound pollution that's invisible to our eyes, but potentially significant for creatures that rely on acoustic information. The deep ocean soundscape reminds us that darkness doesn't equal silence, that creatures without functional eyes might still sense their environment richly through sound, detecting prey, avoiding predators, finding mates, navigating through space using acoustic cues we barely understand. It's another dimension of the deep ocean that remains largely unexplored. Sounds that exist whether we listen or not, carrying information, connecting distant organisms, creating an environment as complex acoustically as any visual landscape. And this acoustic dimension of the deep ocean, like so many aspects of the abyss, remains mostly unknown, most sounds unrecorded, most acoustic behaviors unobserved, most communication channels undeciphered, waiting for scientists with the right equipment and patience to listen and interpret what they hear. As we've explored the deep ocean, we've encountered creatures adapted in remarkable ways to extreme conditions, organisms that solve problems of survival through evolution's patient process of variation and selection. But this raises an interesting question worth contemplating as we drift deeper into our journey. What role does intelligence play in the deep ocean, and how might we recognize it if we encountered it in forms unlike those we're familiar with? Intelligence is difficult to define even on land, where we can observe behavior extensively. Is it problem-solving ability, self-awareness, tool use, communication complexity, social organization? Different definitions lead to different conclusions about which creatures possess intelligence and to what degree. In the deep ocean, where observation is limited and behavior is harder to study, the question becomes even more challenging. Octopuses, which exist at various ocean depths though most prefer shallower waters, display behaviors that suggest considerable intelligence. They can solve mazes, use tools, demonstrate what appears to be planning and foresight. They're individuals, with behaviours that vary from one octopus to another, suggesting something beyond pure instinct. And they've evolved this intelligence along a completely different evolutionary pathway from vertebrates, suggesting that intelligence can arise independently when conditions favour it. Some deep-sea creatures might possess capabilities we'd recognise as intelligence if we could observe them more extensively. Deep-sea octopuses exist, though we know little about their behaviour compared to their shallow water relatives. Do they solve problems, use their environment creatively, plan hunting strategies? We don't know. Because watching deep-sea octopuses behave naturally requires equipment and time most researchers don't have access to. But intelligence might also exist in forms we wouldn't immediately recognise. Consider the tube worms at hydrothermal vents, living their entire lives attached to one spot on the seafloor. They have no brain, no nervous system in the conventional sense. By most definitions, they wouldn't be considered intelligent. Yet they've solved the problem of survival in one of the most challenging environments on Earth, maintaining symbiotic relationships with bacteria, extracting nutrients from toxic chemicals, reproducing successfully. Is that a kind of intelligence, encoded not in neurons but in biochemistry and structure? Perhaps intelligence in the deep ocean is less about individual cleverness and more about evolutionary intelligence, the accumulated wisdom of millions of years of adaptation, encoded in genes and behaviour patterns. A deep-sea fish that positions itself optimally to ambush prey isn't making a conscious decision in the way we understand decision-making. It's following instincts refined over countless generations. But those instincts represent a kind of knowledge about the environment, about what works and what doesn't, accumulated and preserved through evolutionary time. There's also the question of what challenges in the deep ocean would favour the evolution of intelligence. On land and in shallow waters, intelligence often relates to social complexity, predator-prey dynamics, manipulating the environment, solving novel problems. But in the deep ocean, where encounters with other organisms are rare, where the environment changes slowly, where behaviour patterns optimised over millions of years work adequately, what pressure would drive the evolution of flexible, creative intelligence? The scarcity of food in the deep ocean might actually favour simplicity over intelligence. A large brain requires enormous energy to maintain. Humans devote roughly 20% of our metabolic budget to supporting brain function. In an environment where food is scarce and encounters are infrequent, spending resources on a large brain that enables complex thought might be disadvantageous compared to simplifying, reducing brain size, relying on simpler but more energy-efficient behaviour patterns. This doesn't mean deep-sea creatures are unintelligent in any absolute sense. It means they're adapted to their environment, and that environment might not reward the kind of intelligence we recognise and value. An anglerfish waiting motionlessly for prey, conserving energy, patient beyond human understanding, possesses its own kind of wisdom, an approach to life perfectly suited to conditions where activity cost energy that might not be replenished soon. Perhaps the question of intelligence in the deep ocean matters less than the question of adaptation, of how well creatures solve the specific problems their environment presents. By that measure, deep-sea organisms are supremely successful, having persisted for millions of years in conditions that would kill most life on Earth almost instantly. They might not build tools or solve puzzles, but they've solved the far more fundamental problem of survival in the abyss. And as we continue our slow drift through this exploration, contemplating the creatures that exist in darkness and cold and pressure, perhaps what matters most isn't whether they're intelligent in human terms, but that they exist at all, that life has found ways to thrive even here, in conditions so far removed from the environments where consciousness and intelligence evolved. Every night across the world's oceans, the largest migration on Earth takes place. It involves not millions, but billions of creatures, rising from the depths toward the surface as darkness falls, then descending again before dawn. It's called the Deal vertical migration, and it represents one of the most significant movements of biomass on the planet. Yet most people have never heard of it, because it happens entirely underwater, invisible unless you know where and how to look. The migrants are primarily small creatures, zooplankton, small fish, squid and crustaceans that spend daylight hours in the twilight and midnight zones, anywhere from several hundred to several thousand feet below the surface. As the sun sets and surface waters darken, they begin ascending, swimming upward toward the productive surface waters where food is more abundant. They feed through the night, consuming phytoplankton and smaller zooplankton, gaining energy they'll need to survive the next day in the deep. Before dawn, they descend again, moving back into deeper waters where they're safe from visual predators that hunt in daylight. Some migrate only a few hundred feet vertically, others travel more than 2,000 feet, a journey that can take hours each way, expending significant energy but evidently worth the cost for access to more abundant food in surface waters. The migration is so massive it can be detected by sonar from ships. During World War II, sonar operators detected what they called the deep scattering layer, a band of sonar reflections that rose toward the surface at night and descended during the day. They initially thought it might be the seafloor, but the seafloor doesn't move, and this layer clearly did. Eventually scientists realized they were detecting the accumulated mass of migrating organisms, so numerous that their collective bodies reflected sonar signals strongly enough to register as a false bottom. This migration has profound implications for ocean ecosystems. The migrating creatures feed in surface waters, then carry that energy into the deep ocean when they descend. It's a vertical transport of energy and nutrients, connecting surface and deep ocean in ways that pure sinking of marine snow cannot. The migrants essentially package surface productivity and deliver it to depth, supporting communities of predators that hunt them in the twilight and midnight zones. The migration also represents a predator avoidance strategy. Surface waters during daylight contain visual predators, fish with eyes optimized for seeing in bright light, capable of spotting and catching small creatures. By descending below the well-lit zone during daytime, migrants reduce their exposure to these predators. At night, when visual predation becomes less effective, they can safely feed in surface waters with reduced risk. But they don't entirely escape predation. Many deep-sea predators have evolved to hunt migrating organisms. Some wait in the twilight zone, intercepting migrants as they pass through during ascent and descent. Others follow the migration, remaining with the layer of organisms as it moves vertically. The migration creates hunting opportunities for predators at multiple depths, supporting food webs throughout the water column. What's remarkable is how widespread this migration is. It occurs in oceans worldwide, from tropical to polar regions, involving thousands of species. The specifics vary by location and season, different species migrating at different times or to different depths, but the general pattern holds globally. Every ocean contains these nightly mass movements. These vast assemblages of creatures rising and falling through the water column in response to light levels. Scientists study the migration using nets, acoustic equipment, and increasingly underwater cameras and autonomous vehicles that can follow organisms through their vertical journeys. These studies reveal fascinating details. Some species migrate every night throughout their lives. Others migrate only when young, settling into deeper or shallower waters as they mature. Some follow the moon cycle, modifying their migration depth based on lunar illumination. The migration also has implications for carbon cycling in the ocean. When organisms feed at the surface, they consume carbon fixed by photosynthesis. When they descend and metabolize that food or produce waste or dye, they release that carbon at depth, effectively pumping carbon from the surface to the deep ocean. This biological carbon pump represents a significant pathway for carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere, though one that operates on timescales of decades to centuries as deep water eventually returns to the surface. Understanding the Deal vertical migration helps us appreciate that the ocean isn't stratified into independent layers, but is constantly mixing energy and nutrients and organisms moving between depths, creating connections that link surface and deep in dynamic, complex ways. The ocean is fluid in both the literal and metaphorical sense. It's zones connected by the movements of countless creatures following rhythms established over millions of years. We've spent much of this journey discussing what we don't know about the deep ocean, the unmapped terrain, the unexplored trenches, the uncatalogued species. But there's another dimension of unknown territory worth contemplating, one that exists not in geographical space, but in the complexity of ocean systems themselves, in the relationships and processes that connect different parts of the ocean in ways we're only beginning to understand. The ocean operates as a system, not a collection of isolated parts. Surface and deep ocean connect through the vertical migration we just discussed, through the sinking of marine snow, through currents that carry water from surface to depth, and back again over timescales of centuries. What happens at the surface eventually affects the deep ocean. What happens in the deep ocean eventually affects the surface. They're parts of one integrated whole, and understanding that whole requires understanding the connections. Current systems, for instance, move water around the globe in patterns we call the ocean conveyor belt, or thermohaline circulation. Warm water flows along the surface from equatorial regions toward the poles. At the poles, it cools and sinks, becoming dense enough to flow along the bottom toward the equator again. This creates a global circulation pattern that takes roughly 1,000 years for water to complete one full circuit, rising at the equator, flowing poleward, sinking at high latitudes, flowing back along the bottom. This circulation carries heat, which affects global climate. It carries nutrients, which affects biological productivity. It carries dissolved gases, including oxygen and carbon dioxide, which affects both chemistry and life. And it operates on timescales that make it difficult to study directly. We can measure current speeds and directions. We can track water masses using their temperature and salinity signatures. But observing the full cycle requires centuries of continuous measurement we don't yet have. There are also chemical cycles operating in the ocean that we understand incompletely. The carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, the cycles of trace nutrients like iron and silica, all involve complex interactions between biology, chemistry, and physics. Organisms take up nutrients, incorporate them into tissue, die, sink, decompose, releasing those nutrients back into the water where they can be used again, or continue sinking to greater depths. Eventually, currents return deep water to the surface, bringing nutrients back into the sunlit zone where photosynthesis can use them. But the details of these cycles, the rates at which they operate, the factors that control them, the ways they respond to changes in temperature or chemistry or biology, these remain areas of active research and considerable uncertainty. We can measure parts of the cycles, but measuring complete fluxes requires sampling across vast areas and depths over long time periods, a task that challenges our resources and technology. The biological diversity of the ocean represents another kind of unmapped territory. We've catalogued perhaps 250,000 marine species, but estimates suggest the total might be anywhere from 500,000 to several million, depending on how you count microscopic organisms and the many species that look superficially similar but are genetically distinct. Each species represents a solution to survival in specific conditions, a set of adaptations and behaviors and ecological relationships that took millions of years to evolve. Understanding marine biodiversity isn't just about listing species. It's about understanding how communities assemble, how species interact, who eats whom, who competes with whom, how energy and nutrients flow through food webs. It's about recognizing that ecosystems are not static collections of species, but dynamic systems that can shift and reorganize in response to changes in conditions, or the addition or removal of key species. The deep ocean contains much of this unknown biological diversity, species that exist in small populations scattered across vast areas, making them difficult to find and study. Some might be endemic to single seamounts or small sections of mid-ocean ridges. Others might have wide distributions but low population densities, present in many locations but rare everywhere. Cataloguing this diversity, understanding the ecology of each species, comprehending how deep sea communities function, represents work that will occupy scientists for generations. Perhaps what's most striking about these unmapped territories within ocean systems is how they remind us that understanding isn't just about collecting facts, but about comprehending relationships, patterns, processes that connect facts into meaningful knowledge. We can map the seafloor and still not understand how currents shape it. We can count species and still not understand how they interact. We can measure chemistry and still not fully understand how biology affects it. The ocean contains mysteries not just in what exists, but in how it all works together, in the emergent properties of a complex system that's more than the sum of its parts. And unravelling those mysteries requires not just exploration but synthesis, bringing together knowledge from different fields and perspectives to build comprehensive understanding of how our ocean functions. Throughout history, when humans have finally gained the technology to explore previously inaccessible places, we've consistently found those places to be different from what we imagined, richer than we expected, more complex than our theories predicted, and usually more wonderful than our speculation suggested. The deep ocean has followed this pattern, revealing itself gradually as we've developed the capability to visit it, always surprising us, always challenging our assumptions about what's possible. When the first deep-sea expeditions brought up samples in the 19th century, finding life at depths previously thought lifeless, it overturned existing scientific consensus and opened new questions about the limits of life. When we discovered hydrothermal vents and their chemosynthetic ecosystems, it fundamentally changed our understanding of where and how life could exist. When we reached the deepest trenches and found fish swimming there, it demonstrated that even the most extreme environments on Earth can support complex vertebrates. Each discovery has expanded our sense of possibility, our understanding of life's adaptability, our appreciation for the solutions evolution finds to seemingly impossible challenges. And each discovery has revealed how much we still don't know, how many questions remain unanswered, how vast the unknown territory still is even after decades of exploration. There's a pattern to these discoveries that's worth contemplating. We tend to underestimate life's resilience and overestimate the severity of what we consider extreme conditions. What seems impossible to us, creatures adapted to surface conditions, turns out to be perfectly manageable for organisms that evolved in those conditions. Crushing pressure isn't crushing if you're built to withstand it. Complete darkness isn't limiting if you've evolved other senses or your own light. Extreme cold isn't deadly if your biochemistry is optimized for low temperatures. This has implications beyond Earth. If life can thrive in the deep ocean, in conditions so different from the surface environments where life presumably originated, then perhaps life can exist in environments we haven't yet considered habitable. Perhaps Europa's subsurface ocean hosts life that has never known sunlight, existing on chemical energy from the moon's interior. Perhaps Enceladus's geysers hint at ecosystems beneath ice, thriving in ways we can barely imagine because we haven't yet explored similar environments on Earth. The deep ocean, in this sense, serves as a laboratory for understanding life's possibilities, a place to test our assumptions about habitability, to learn what's truly necessary for life versus what's merely familiar to us, because that's what we happen to have evolved in. Each deep-sea ecosystem teaches us something about the minimum requirements for life, the necessary versus the contingent, the universal principles versus the local adaptations. But beyond its implications for astrobiology, the deep ocean matters simply because it exists, because it's part of our planet, because understanding Earth means understanding the ocean that covers most of its surface. We live on an ocean world, yet we've focused most of our attention on the small fraction of Earth that rises above sea level. we've mapped Mars more completely than our own ocean floor. We've catalogued the stars more thoroughly than we've catalogued deep-sea species. This isn't necessarily wrong. Space exploration has its own value, its own importance for understanding our place in the universe. But it's worth recognizing that we have an entire planet to explore right here. Mysteries in our own ocean that rival anything we might find on other worlds, creatures as alien as any we might encounter in space, environments as extreme as any beyond Earth. And unlike space exploration, ocean exploration has immediate practical value. The ocean regulates our climate, produces much of our oxygen, provides food for billions of people, contains resources we rely on, and absorbs much of the carbon dioxide we emit. Understanding how it functions isn't just intellectually interesting, it's necessary for managing our relationship with the planet we live on, for making informed decisions about how we use ocean resources, for predicting and potentially mitigating changes in climate and chemistry. The deep ocean also contains aesthetic and philosophical value that's harder to quantify but no less real. There's beauty in bioluminescent creatures creating living light in the darkness. There's wonder in ecosystems that function without sunlight, powered by chemistry from the Earth itself. There's something profound about knowing that vast spaces exist on our planet that remain largely unknown, that mystery and discovery are still possible even in our heavily explored and documented world. When we look into the abyss, when we finally illuminate corners of the deep ocean that have existed in darkness since the Earth formed, we find not the monsters of medieval imagination, but the intricate reality of life adapting to every available niche, creating communities and ecosystems as complex and interconnected as those in more familiar environments, demonstrating over and over that life finds a way, given the barest minimum of necessary conditions. For most of its existence, the deep ocean was separate from human influence, too deep for our activities to affect it directly, isolated by pressure and distance from the surface world, where our species evolved and built civilizations. But gradually, as our technology improved and our numbers grew and our impact on the planet expanded, even the deep ocean has begun to show signs of human presence, evidence that nowhere on Earth remains entirely untouched by our activities. The most visible evidence is debris. Plastic, which we've manufactured in enormous quantities for less than a century, has made its way to the deepest parts of the ocean. Camera systems deployed in trenches have photographed plastic bags in the Mariana Trench, more than 6 miles below the surface. Microplastics, tiny fragments broken down from larger pieces, have been found in sediment cores from the deep ocean floor, in the digestive systems of deep-sea creatures, even in the tissues of organisms that have never directly encountered solid plastic but have absorbed it from their food. This plastic persists, degrading slowly in the cold, dark conditions of the deep ocean, potentially remaining for centuries or longer, accumulating in sediments, being consumed by organisms that cannot digest it, working its way through food webs in ways we're only beginning to understand. It's a form of pollution that will outlast most human structures, a legacy we're leaving in the abyss whether we intend to or not. But plastic is just the most visible form of human impact. Chemical pollutants, including persistent organic compounds and heavy metals, have been detected in deep-sea organisms, concentrated in the tissues of predators at the top of food webs through bioaccumulation. These chemicals originate from industrial processes, agricultural runoff, mining operations, all surface activities that seem far removed from the deep ocean, but are connected to it through the movement of water and settling of particles. Overfishing affects the deep ocean both directly and indirectly. Some deep sea fish species, particularly those that aggregate around seamounts, have been targeted by commercial fishing, populations depleted before scientists even fully understood their biology and life history. The indirect effects might be even more significant, as removing large numbers of surface fish changes food web dynamics, potentially affecting the amount and type of organic matter that sinks to the deep ocean, altering the food supply for deep-sea communities. Climate change is beginning to affect the deep ocean as well, though more slowly than surface waters. The ocean has absorbed much of the excess heat from greenhouse gas warming, with some of that heat gradually penetrating into deeper layers. It's also absorbed roughly a third of the carbon dioxide we've emitted, causing ocean acidification that affects not just surface waters, but eventually deeper layers as well. The full impacts of these changes on deep-sea ecosystems remain uncertain, but there's no reason to assume the deep ocean will be immune to effects that are already transforming surface marine environments. Mining represents a potential future impact that concerns scientists studying deep-sea ecosystems. The seafloor contains deposits of valuable minerals, including rare earth elements and metals used in electronics and batteries. As land-based deposits become harder to access and more expensive to mine, interest has grown in deep-sea mining, extracting resources from the ocean floor. But such mining would inevitably affect benthic ecosystems, potentially destroying slow-growing communities like cold-water corals that take centuries to develop and might take centuries more to recover. If they can recover at all. These impacts raise questions about our relationship with the deep ocean, about whether we have responsibilities to ecosystems we barely understand, communities we've only recently discovered, spaces that exist independently of human needs and wants. The deep ocean doesn't need us. It functioned perfectly well for billions of years without human presence. But we increasingly affect it, intentionally or unintentionally, through activities that seem remote from the deep sea floor, but are connected to it through the physical and chemical linkages that make the ocean a single system. Perhaps what's needed is a form of humility, a recognition that our incomplete knowledge of the deep ocean means we should be cautious about activities that might harm it irreversibly. We don't fully understand how deep-sea ecosystems function, how species interact, how long recovery takes from disturbances, what the consequences might be of removing key species or destroying critical habitats. Given this uncertainty, perhaps we should err on the side of caution, protecting what we don't yet understand while we work to understand it better. The deep ocean has been called the last frontier on Earth, and in many ways it is. But frontiers in human history have often been exploited before being understood, resources extracted before their value beyond extraction was recognized. Perhaps with the deep ocean, we have the opportunity to learn before we impact, to understand before we exploit, to appreciate what exists before deciding what to change or remove or use for our own purposes. Creating effective protection for deep-sea ecosystems presents challenges that differ from conservation efforts in more accessible environments, largely because we're trying to protect places we've barely explored, organisms we've barely catalogued, ecosystems we barely understand. How do you establish boundaries for protected areas when you haven't mapped the seafloor in detail? How do you determine which species need protection when you don't know which species exist? How do you regulate activities when you can't easily monitor whether regulations are being followed? Despite these challenges, some efforts toward deep-sea conservation have emerged in recent decades, driven by recognition that waiting for complete understanding might mean waiting until after damage has already occurred. Marine protected areas have been established that include deep-sea habitats, prohibiting or limiting fishing, mining, and other extractive activities within their boundaries. Some seamounts have been protected after studies showed they hosted unique communities vulnerable to bottom trawling. Some hydrothermal vent fields have been designated as protected sites, preserving them for scientific study and preventing exploitation of the mineral deposits they contain. International waters, which cover much of the deep ocean beyond national jurisdiction, present particular governance challenges. No single nation controls these areas, which means protection requires international cooperation and agreement. The United Nations has been working for years on treaties to govern activities in international waters, including deep-sea mining, with the goal of balancing resource use with conservation and ensuring that any exploitation benefits humanity broadly, rather than just the nations or companies with technology to access these resources. But enforcement remains difficult. The deep ocean is vast, remote, largely unmonitored, except by the very parties whose activities might need regulating. Unlike forests, where satellite imagery can detect illegal logging, or surface fisheries, where patrol vessels can observe activity, the deep ocean's inaccessibility makes it challenging to verify that regulations are being followed. Protection often relies more on cooperation and shared values than on active enforcement, which works well when all parties agree on conservation goals, but becomes problematic when economic incentives conflict with preservation. There's also the question of what. Specifically, we're trying to protect. Should protection focus on unique features like hydrothermal vents and seamounts? On representative areas that preserve samples of different habitat types? On places that support commercial species during parts of their life cycle? On areas identified as biodiversity hotspots? Different goals suggest different protection strategies, and with limited resources for establishing and managing protected areas, choices must be made about priorities. Some scientists argue for a precautionary approach, establishing broad protections now before human activities expand further into the deep ocean, then potentially adjusting those protections as knowledge improves. Others advocate for targeted protection of areas known to host unique or vulnerable ecosystems, leaving other areas available for sustainable use. Both approaches have merit, and perhaps both are necessary in different contexts. Broad protection where activities haven't yet expanded, targeted protection where specific values have been identified. The concept of ecosystem services provides one framework for thinking about deep ocean protection. Ecosystems provide benefits to humans, including food, climate regulation, nutrient cycling, and simply existing as sources of wonder and scientific discovery. Protecting deep-sea ecosystems might be justified not just for their intrinsic value, but for the services they provide, the role they play in maintaining ocean health, their contribution to global systems that humanity depends on. But placing value primarily on services to humans can miss what might be the most compelling argument for protection, which is simply that these ecosystems exist, that they've developed over millions of years of evolution, that they function independently of human needs, and that their existence and functioning has value beyond any use we might make of them. A hydrothermal vent community doesn't exist to provide genetic resources for biotechnology, or to sequester carbon, or to fascinate scientists. It exists because conditions there permit it to exist, because evolution has created organisms adapted to those conditions, because the system has found a stable state that persists over time. Recognizing this inherent value, this existence independent of human purpose, might lead to different conservation decisions than focusing solely on ecosystem services or resource management. It might suggest that we should protect the deep ocean not because we need it, but because it doesn't need us, because it has its own integrity and completeness that deserves preservation, regardless of whether we fully understand it or derive benefit from it. These are philosophical questions as much as practical ones, questions about our relationship with nature, our responsibilities to other forms of life, our values about what matters beyond immediate human needs, and perhaps they're questions worth contemplating slowly, carefully, as we've been doing throughout this journey, allowing complexity and nuance to emerge rather than rushing to simple answers. What does the deep ocean teach us if we're willing to listen, if we're willing to sit with the knowledge we've gained about life in the abyss and let it inform our understanding of our world and our place in it? Perhaps the lessons are many, touching different aspects of how we think about life, adaptation, knowledge, and the limits of our understanding. The deep ocean teaches humility, first and foremost, the recognition that our direct experience of the world is limited to a tiny fraction of the environments that exist on our own planet. We evolved in air and sunlight, in conditions of moderate temperature and low pressure, and our intuitions about what's possible are calibrated to those conditions. But most of our planet exists in conditions utterly unlike those we're adapted to, and life has found ways to thrive in those conditions, demonstrating that our intuitions about habitability are often wrong, or at least incomplete. This humility extends to knowledge itself. We know so little about the ocean that covers most of our planet. 95% unexplored isn't just a number. It represents vast spaces where life exists and evolves and interacts in ways we haven't observed, species we haven't catalogued, processes we haven't measured, patterns we haven't recognized. And if we know so little about our own planet, how much do we know about the universe beyond it? How confident should we be in claims about what's possible or impossible when our experience is so limited? The deep ocean also teaches us about adaptation, about evolution's creativity in finding solutions to challenges that seem insurmountable. Crushing pressure, evolve bodies without compressible spaces and proteins that function under pressure. Absolute darkness, evolve your own light or senses that don't depend on vision. Scarcity of food, evolve slow metabolism and the ability to survive long periods without eating. Complete isolation. Evolve life cycles that work with rare encounters and reproductive strategies that maximize success despite low population densities. These solutions aren't products of conscious thought or planning. They emerge through the patient process of variation and selection over millions of years. Organisms that happen to have features that work slightly better than others, leaving slightly more offspring, gradually shifting populations toward better adaptation. It's a process without foresight or intention, yet it produces results that seem almost impossibly clever, almost designed. Though they're actually just the accumulated result of countless small improvements. Perhaps this teaches us patience, the value of slow, incremental progress toward understanding. Science operates somewhat like evolution in this regard. Individual studies are like mutations, variations in understanding that might or might not improve our knowledge. Good studies that advance understanding are selected, built upon by other researchers. Poor studies are generally discarded, not replicated. Gradually forgotten. Over time, understanding improves, not through sudden revolutionary insights, though those occasionally occur, but through steady accumulation of reliable knowledge. The stability of the deep ocean, its unchanging conditions over timescales of centuries or millennia, might teach us something about what we value. We live in a world of constant change, of novelty and innovation and disruption. But there's value in stability too, in conditions that remain constant, in systems that persist largely unchanged over long periods. The deep ocean's stability has allowed extraordinary specialization, evolution of organisms exquisitely adapted to specific conditions. Perhaps there are domains where we should value stability over innovation, preservation over development, allowing systems to optimize rather than constantly disrupting them. The interconnection of ocean systems, surface and deep, linked by currents and migrations and falling organic matter, teaches us that separating complex systems into independent parts often obscures important dynamics. The ocean isn't a collection of isolated zones, but an integrated whole. What happens anywhere eventually affecting everywhere else. This might be true of other systems we deal with, ecological systems certainly, but also social systems, economic systems, any complex system with feedback loops and connections that make simple cause-effect thinking inadequate. And perhaps most fundamentally, the deep ocean teaches us that mystery is still possible, that wonder is still available, that we can still discover, still be surprised, still find things we didn't expect in places we're just beginning to look. In a world that can sometimes feel fully known, fully mapped, fully understood, the unexplored ocean reminds us that we're still in the early stages of understanding our planet, still making basic discoveries, still learning what exists right here beneath the waves. These lessons aren't prescriptive. The deep ocean doesn't tell us how to live or what to do, but it offers perspectives, ways of thinking about life and adaptation and knowledge that might inform how we approach questions and challenges in other domains. And it offers something perhaps equally valuable, which is simply the knowledge that extraordinary things exist, that complexity and beauty and strangeness are real, that the universe, including the part of it we live on, remains endlessly fascinating for those willing to explore it. And so we find ourselves near the end of our journey, having descended through zones of light and darkness, explored vents and seeps and seamounts and trenches, encountered creatures adapted to extremes, contemplated questions of intelligence and protection, and what it all means. We've travelled through time as well as depth, from early explorations in steel spheres to modern understanding of complex ecosystems, from maps that showed monsters to maps that show mountains we've barely begun to survey. But perhaps the most honest thing to acknowledge as we prepare to return to the surface is how little we've truly covered, how much remains not just unexplored but unmentioned. Entire categories of deep sea life we haven't discussed, geological processes we haven't explained, ecological relationships we haven't examined. The deep ocean is so vast, so complex, so rich with phenomena that even a 2.5-hour journey can only touch on fragments of what exists there. There are entire groups of organisms we haven't mentioned. The jellies that drift through the midnight zone, some with tentacles trailing hundreds of feet, others so delicate they can barely survive being brought to the surface intact. The sea cucumbers that crawl across the abyssal plains, looking like ambulatory vegetables but playing crucial roles in processing sediment and cycling nutrients. The sea pens and sea lilies and glass sponges that create three-dimensional structure on the seafloor, providing habitat for other organisms in environments that would otherwise be flat expanses of sediment. There are phenomena we haven't explored. The deep scattering layers we mentioned briefly actually consist of multiple layers, different organisms migrating to different depths, creating a complex vertical structure in the water column that changes with time of day and lunar phase. The marine snow that falls from surface waters can form aggregates, larger particles that sink faster than individual pieces, creating pulses of food availability that deep-sea communities have adapted to exploit. There are connections we haven't fully traced. The way that iron from dust blown off continents fertilizes surface waters, increasing productivity, affecting how much organic matter eventually reaches the deep ocean. The way that whales, feeding at depth and defecating at the surface, pump nutrients upward, supporting productivity in surface waters. The way that ocean chemistry, affected by geological processes at spreading centres, influences the availability of elements necessary for life, shaping what kinds of organisms can thrive in different locations. And there are mysteries we haven't resolved. Strange sounds recorded in the deep ocean, most eventually identified but some still unknown. Behaviours observed briefly but never studied systematically. Species represented by single specimens, collected once and never seen again. Ecosystems that might exist in places we haven't yet explored. Variations on themes we know, or entirely novel communities unlike anything we've discovered. This incompleteness isn't a failure of our journey. It's a reflection of reality, of the fact that the deep ocean contains more than can be comprehended in a single exploration, more than can be fully known in a human lifetime, perhaps more than can ever be completely catalogued and understood. And there's something almost comforting about that, about knowing that mystery persists, that discovery remains possible, that wonder is still available. If we've learned anything over these hours together, perhaps it's that the deep ocean isn't empty or dead or alien in a hostile sense. It's full of life, teeming with organisms adapted to conditions we find extreme but they find normal, supporting ecosystems as complex and functional as those anywhere on Earth. It's connected to the surface world we know, influencing climate and chemistry and life in ways we're still working to fully understand. And it remains largely unknown, not because we lack curiosity or capability, but because it's genuinely difficult to explore, genuinely vast, genuinely complex enough that understanding it requires patience and resources and sustained effort over long periods of time. We've made remarkable progress in the past century, developing technology that lets us visit depths that were impossible to reach before. discovering ecosystems that transformed our understanding of life's possibilities. But we've also only begun, barely scratched the surface, or in this case, barely touched the bottom of what there is to learn. The ocean keeps its secrets not through hostility, but through simple geography, through being large and deep and difficult to access. And those secrets wait, patiently, in the darkness, existing whether we observe them or not, continuing their ancient patterns, indifferent to whether humans ever understand them. Perhaps that's as it should be, the ocean maintaining its mystery, reminding us that we're not the measure of all things, that existence precedes our observation of it, that the world is larger and stranger and more wonderful than we can fully comprehend, and that this is not a problem to solve but a reality to accept and perhaps even to celebrate. And so we've travelled together, you and I, through 2.5 hours that have taken us from the surface down to the deepest trenches on Earth, through zones of fading light and total darkness, past creatures that glow with their own luminescence and others that have evolved beyond the need for sight. We've explored vents where chemistry creates life without sunlight, seamounts that rise like hidden mountains from the abyssal plains, trenches that plunge deeper than mountains rise tall. From the first hesitant descents in steel spheres to modern understanding of complex ecosystems powered by chemicals from the Earth itself, from maps that warned of monsters to maps that revealed topography we're only beginning to survey, we've traced the history of how humans learned to explore the abyss and what we found when we finally developed the technology to look. We've discovered that the ocean floor isn't empty or barren, but populated with communities as vibrant and diverse as those in more familiar environments. We've learned that life adapts to whatever conditions exist, finding ways to thrive even in crushing pressure and freezing cold and absolute darkness. We've understood that the deep ocean isn't separate from the world we know, but connected to it through currents and migrations and falling organic matter, part of an integrated system that regulates our planet's climate and chemistry. And we've confronted the truth that for all we've learned, 95% of the ocean remains unexplored, unmapped, barely understood. There are more seamounts than we've catalogued, more species than we've described, more ecosystems than we've studied. The deep ocean keeps its secrets simply by being vast and deep and difficult to access, not through hostility, but through geography. Perhaps the answer, as honestly as I can give it, to the question of what exists in the abyss we still can't map is simply this. More than we yet know, less than we might fear, stranger than we expect, and more wonderful than our speculation suggests. The deep ocean contains life that has found solutions to every challenge that environment presents, communities that function in darkness using strategies we're still working to understand, species adapted so completely to extreme conditions that those conditions aren't extreme to them but simply normal, the only environment they know. If you enjoyed this slow drift through the unknown ocean, a like helps others find these calm explorations of our planet's hidden places. And if you have thoughts about the deep sea, about what most surprised you, or what you'd like to understand better, the comments are always open. To those of you who've been here before, who return to these long journeys night after night, thank you. Your presence makes this worthwhile. Wherever you are in the world right now, whatever time it is, whatever brought you to this exploration of the abyss, I hope you found some peace in this journey. I hope your breathing has slowed, matching the slow rhythm of currents that move through the deep ocean. I hope your thoughts have quieted, settling like marine snow drifting through dark water. I hope your body feels heavy and warm, the weight of the day finally lifting, the tension releasing, everything settling into stillness. Look up at the surface, if you can imagine it, 6 miles above where we've been together tonight. All that water between here and there, all that pressure, all those zones we descended through, twilight fading to midnight, midnight deepening to the Hadal zone. And somewhere in all that water, creatures are living their lives, hunting and hiding, feeding and reproducing, following patterns established over millions of years, indifferent to whether we observe them, existing in their own right. complete without needing our understanding. Perhaps what we've learned tonight is that the Earth still holds mysteries, that wonder is still possible, that our home planet can still surprise us, still teach us, still offer discoveries to those willing to explore. The abyss we cannot map, the ocean we've barely seen, is not elsewhere, not on another world, but right here, beneath the waves, covering most of our planet, waiting patiently in the dark for the slow work of exploration to eventually illuminate its corners. Sleep well. Dream of living light in the darkness, of creatures adapted to conditions beyond our tolerance, of vast spaces where mystery persists, of an ocean that covers our world and keeps its secrets gently, without malice, simply by being large and deep and genuinely difficult to know completely. Dream of seamounts rising from the abyssal plains, of currents that flow for centuries before returning to the surface, of the quiet patience of creatures that have solved every problem their environment presents. And when you wake, remember that the deep ocean is still there, still unexplored, still full of discoveries waiting to be made, still demonstrating that we live on a planet that remains endlessly fascinating, endlessly mysterious, endlessly capable of surprising those who look with care and patience at what exists beyond the limits of easy observation. Good night, rest well, and thank you for descending into the abyss with me tonight. The ocean will still be there tomorrow, patient and vast and largely unknown, waiting for the next explorer, the next discovery, the next small illumination of the darkness that has existed since the Earth formed. Sleep deeply and dream of the ocean.